Just to let you know a little bit about the panel. It's made up of contributors to the forthcoming volume, which is entitled Called Beyond Ourselves, Vocation and the Common Good, and I'm going to hand you a flyer advertising that book in just a few minutes. It's published by Oxford, by the way. And the argument of the book is that educators can play a key role in shifting the framing of vocation as contributing to the common good. Imagining the good life as flourishing for all means that we understand success as significantly different than a common cultural narrative of prestige or achievement. Recognizing that students come to us with various levels of, I really like the cynicism, brokenness, and obligations to family expectations and personal hope, we seek, and that's these panelists, seek to embed any notion of a good life within what Paul Waddell calls a willingness to move beyond self-centeredness and to live for something greater than ourselves. That's beautiful. This panel considers what it means to be called beyond ourselves as we educate to contribute to communal well-being and the common good. Let me introduce the panelists each. First, you're going to hear from Erin VanLaningham. Am I saying your name correctly? Okay. She is professor of English at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa. I was born in Iowa, that matters. And she's also the director of NetVUE, which stands for Network for Vocation in Undergraduate Education. She's the director of the Scholarly Resources Project for NetVUE. She also co-hosts NetVUE's podcast, which is entitled Callings, a conversation on college, career, and a life well lived. That sounds good too. She's the editor of the forthcoming volume published by Oxford University Press, which these are all contributors to. And so that's part of what this panel's about. Then there's Geoffrey Bateman, who is associate professor in the Department of Peace and Justice Studies at Regis University. He teaches courses on a range of social justice issues, including gender, sexuality, and homelessness, in nonviolent resistance, LGBTQIA activism, and queer justice, and research and writing in the community. His recent scholarship focuses on vocation and includes the essay Queer Callings, LGBTQ Literature and Vocation. Then there is Christine Jeske. Am I saying that correctly? Good. Is professor of anthropology at Wheaton College and author of 3 books, including The Laziness Myth. That sounds intriguing. Her research explores the ways people pursue good lives both in and out of work and the way that Christians address racism. And finally, David Timmerman, who I had the chance to speak to, is currently provost and executive vice president for operations at Carthage College, which is in Wisconsin, a role that he's been in since 2018. And prior to that, he was dean of faculty at Monmouth College for 8 years. And both institutions are and have been active in NetVUE and benefited greatly from it. So just as the panel works, there's 4 panelists, and as a consequence, I want to leave plenty of time for your responses and your questions for them. But Erin starts us out, and then each presenter goes, and she also speaks briefly in between the presenters and then concludes everything. So let's give a round of applause in advance to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's really obviously a privilege to be with all of you. Some of you in the room I recognize, and your work has been influential to the work of this book, so I thank you in advance for that. And I look forward to the dialogue continuing about vocation and the common good. And to my colleagues, we are representative of the 13 contributors to this book. And hopefully you'll get a sense of the other contributions to the book as we move through it. So my hope here is just to kind of talk you through a little bit about the NetVUE Scholarly Resources Project initially. This is the 4th volume in this series that is generously sponsored by the Lilly Endowment in partnership with NetVUE. And so NetVUE stands for the Network for Vocation in Undergraduate Education. It's a consortium of over 300 colleges and universities in Canada and the United States. Also a program of the Council of Independent Colleges. The goal of the NetVUE Scholarly Resources Project is to widen and deepen the scholarship of vocation, and that is our hope today in our presentation. This volume brings together scholars from a variety of disciplines. As you've just heard, we all are representative of different disciplines, but engaging in this sort of common ground of vocation. And in particular, our volume addresses this overlap between individual and collective callings, sort of with an inquiry of what does that look like and how do we work with students to understand that. And as Matt said, this is forthcoming from Oxford University Press very soon. You can pre-order if you would like. So by way of introduction, I will kind of summarize a bit of the introduction to the volume and the argument that is underpinning. So the thesis is that we're attempting to challenge the dominant narrative of personal success and achievement that grips students, and instead to sort of offer very directly our obligations to care to and care for others in our world. So really sort of shifting the conversation in that narrative about vocation to start with those obligations of care for others in our world. We have a sustained conversation about collective callings. What does it mean to understand our summons to a shared place? This meeting of collective and individual purpose. Along the way, we're attempting to widen and reframe the language of vocation and the language of the common good. So we sort of take to task the frameworks that we are comfortable with and enjoy and use, but also are trying to kind of expand and broaden and deepen how we can use those with our students. And then hopefully today you'll also hear about some of the strategies, models, and pedagogies that are in the volume that we each use or introduce. So to begin with models for vocation and the common good, I'll begin with where a lot of people begin, which is Frederick Buechner's iteration of vocation, the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. It's the place that God calls you to, right? And what we're doing in the volume collectively is to emphasize that meeting place. So not in particular piece of deep gladness or certainly a deeper focus on the hungers of the world, but this meeting place between the two. Another way to think about it is potentially to look at Buechner's other iteration here, the kind of work that you most need to do and that the world most needs to have done. We suggest what would happen if we talked with students about the world first, if we asked letter B first instead of letter A. Throughout the volume, we are drawing models of interdependence and common life from a variety of faith traditions, but also from literature, culture, and history, from civic participation models, and the language and research in ecology. And so we're trying to sort of expand resources as well that we can use to think about vocation and the common good. So as we think about the vocabulary of vocation, many of you probably know the work of David Cunningham and his language about vocation as being dynamic, elastic, capacious, helpful to us in our work. And also that it's a bridge language, and that's where we believe that it's the most useful with students. And our aim in the volume is to orient that language toward communal flourishing. So when we talk about vocation in this volume, we're oftentimes using the language of connection, mutuality, membership, responsibility, solidarity, and compassion. So those are the sort of leanings that you'll see. We attempt to embed the notion of the good life within what Paul Waddell says, and I think this is the quote that Matt just read, a willingness to move beyond self-centeredness and to live for something greater than ourselves. So again, starting with that definition. We talked extensively as a group as we were writing the book about responding to the crises of the world and vocational listening. And really, oftentimes models of vocation talk about reflection and deep silence and the need for time and space. We really wanted to instead think about the contemplation and action, engaging with the noise of the world, being able to discern alongside and sort of through the crises that we are faced with, and along with our students then teach dialogue, deliberation, reflection, and action as part of that. And finally, the volume ends with a section on the university and really reframing the call of the university to orient toward the common good. And so what about this language of the common good? Obviously, when you sort of gather different voices in a room, the idea of coming to any sort of consensus or understanding about commonness and goodness is a significant part of that conversation, but also to understand the various iterations and respect for all of those. So I wanted to start with Jedediah Purdy's concept where he says the creation of new kinds of solidarity, new ways to feel that your good life is part of my good life, and an injury to you is an injury to me. So while maybe not a direct definition of the common good, at least a good starting point for conversation. And throughout the volume, we use different language for the common good. We use the common good, a common good, collective well-being, the commons, goods, and the uncommon good. So I apologize if you came to the session looking for a really succinct definition of the common good, but we believe that was in the spirit of being flexible and dynamic and capacious, that sort of all of those language ways of thinking really are helpful. Again, we use language of flourishing of all, the good life, collective well-being, communal wellness. So as we think about vocation and the common good for ourselves, for higher education, and for our students, then we want to kind of invite people into a conversation about, well, what does it mean in our commons to attempt to break structures of oppression, to listen, to cultivate skills of dialogue and empathy, to work for justice, to value the uncommon. So those are some of the goals of seeking vocation within the context of the common good. Along the way, we talk about citizens sacrificing private interests to constitute the good human life of the multitude, and that's Jacques Maritain there for those of you who may recognize his work. I also draw on the work of James Farrell, who talks about the commons good and our care for the common home and various common spaces and places that we participate in. And then along the way, we extend the boundaries of the common, and drawing on the work of Danielle Allen, who's a political scientist, talks about disrupting systems, bridging diverse communities to form a connected society. So as we sort of have expanded and broadened the language of both vocation and the common good, I'll kind of bring a few of these things together before I move into part one and Christine's presentation. So vocational reflection in the context of the common good should emphasize social responsibilities and participation for justice. So our argument is that when we talk with students about vocational discernment, that we begin with asking questions about what are our responsibilities to others and how do we participate for justice in that work. This does involve, of course, confronting difficulties, brokenness, struggles of others, collective traumas, systemic injustice. But we believe that there is communal formation that happens in a university context and in all of our work as educators, and to cultivate practices that promote individual and communal flourishing is our aim and ought to be our aim in our classrooms and across campus. So again, that is where the meeting place of deep gladness and deep hunger happen, and that's the sort of point at which we begin the volume. Also drawing on the language of dwelling, this is Norman Wurzba at Duke. He's got the idea that we kind of want to honor our connections that intersect in our points of existence. Our attitude and our orientation to place matter, so the more we can invite students into doing that work. And the writer Scott Russell Sanders says, strength comes, healing comes from aligning yourself with the grain of your place and answering to its needs. So when we talk about the common good, we can talk about local environments, talk about very real needs of our communities that we're a part of. And by aligning ourselves with the grain of those places and answering to it, we are discovering vocation for the common good. So ultimately then, that narrative of individual prestige and success is reframed through this lens. And that brings us to part 1 of the volume, which is Vocation in the Commons. The 4 essays in this section aim to shift frameworks of vocation to identify collective callings. So they kind of take different frameworks and move them to identify the collective. Some of the topics that are addressed in this section are the distributive justice, the representation of diverse and marginalized voices, and membership in communities. And just a couple of the questions that animate across this section: what are foundational definitions of vocation, and in what ways might they be limiting to our achievement of the common good or our discovery of the common good with students? And how is the common good then constitutive and essential to vocation? There are 4 essays. We have one presenter today from the section, Christine Jeske, but the other essays are also on the back of your sheet, so the entire table of contents is there. David McCarthy's essay, Our Call is Response. Deanna Thompson has an essay on Moving Beyond Deep Gladness, Lamenting Trauma and Injustice and Suffering. And Monica Smith's essay on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Justice, Institutional Mission as the Call of the Common Good. At this point, I will turn the podium over to Christine for her to talk about her section. It's the bottom.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so that move over back. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. VanLaningham, for setting up that the book and the framing of that. That makes it easy because I can just dive right into what my chapter talks about. So I want to say that in this, oops, sorry. I thought I had another slide in there. I guess I don't. One of the questions that I was wrestling with as I was planning this chapter was, why is it so hard to link vocation to the common good? And particularly in this space where I know most of us are Christian, right? We should think we're good at this, right? We all love our neighbors and we all care about everybody and we want the world to be a better place, right? But it's harder than you expect. So I want to begin with a story that kind of woke me up to how hard this can be to teach. So I am a professor of cultural anthropology at Wheaton College. And one day I was teaching in this introduction to anthropology class. And we were a few weeks into the class, and this student stopped me during break and said, I think I have a quote on here too. The student said, "Excuse me, you keep talking about culture and social structures, and I still don't think those make a difference in my life. I make decisions in whatever way I want." And I think that woke me up to, there is something that we need to back up and consider. What is at the very basic 101 level of teaching about vocation that could help us link vocation to the wider common good? So here's the overarching question in this talk. Now, as I was thinking about that, what's at the basic 101 level? So I have to underscore how cool this project is. If you've ever worked on an edited volume, probably you just sort of sit alone and struggle through writing and turn it in a few weeks after the deadline and feel bad about yourself. But in this project, Dr. VanLaningham brings us together and we sit in a room for a week and we read common readings and we talk about these things together and we get to know each other and we grow in our thinking through this process. So one of the things we read together was a chapter from the book After Whiteness by Willie James Jennings. And he uses this word that for me came to exemplify what I was wrestling with. And the word was overturning. Here's his quote. He says, "Educational institutions exist inside a revolution, which is the overturning. That is the turning the world right side up by God. It is an overturning that makes possible a beautifully strange kind of building up. It is a building up inside a crumbling. We are inside the Spirit's crumbling of world orders." And as I thought about that idea, Sorry, I think I ended up with my slides out of order. My apologies. As I thought about that idea of overturning, I started trying to identify what exactly needs to be overturned in our ideas in order to treat vocation as a pursuit of the common good. And as an anthropologist, I often think in terms of narratives. So I got curious about what is going on culturally in the narratives that people believe about the good life. What trains us to not think about the common good, but to think about something else instead? And when I talk about narratives, what I'm talking about is not just like bedtime stories or your favorite movies, but these overarching tropes and meta-narratives that we glean from to understand our whole sociocultural setting and how we interpret reality. So I identified two narratives that we are deeply steeped in that I think impede our pursuits of the common good. And I call those two narratives the markets can fix anything narrative and the merit makes me deserve it narrative. I'll talk about those each, but then good news, I also identified two alternative narratives that can guide us in why and how to prioritize the common good. And those narratives tell us that we belong to memberships and we thrive when our memberships involve mutuality, weaving together both giving and receiving. So in this talk, I will very briefly describe each one of those, give one illustration of each, and you'll have to trust me on the scholarly basis for these, and then read the book so you get more examples on how to apply these and the scholarly basis of them. So that first narrative, markets can fix anything. To contribute to the common good, we need to figure out how to distribute resources. And the dominant narrative in Western society that answers that question is markets can solve anything. But if we want to seriously consider how to seek the common good through our vocations, we're going to have to be honest about what markets can do and can't do. Just for clarification, when I say market, I mean a system of distribution in which goods or services are assigned to particular owners who distribute their goods through a process of sellers and buyers negotiating prices among competitive alternatives. It's a powerful and familiar system that allows us to distribute innumerable resources every second across our planet. But here's the thing, markets aren't just a system for distributing resources, they also are supported by narratives that tell us when and how to use markets. Markets are attached to a system of ideas that profoundly affects our relationships with humans and our natural world. Most people at our time and place in history tend to assume that most exchanges happen through markets, but they're not the only system that we can or do use. So to teach how markets work and what they can and can't do, I sometimes begin by asking students the question, if you gather together for a shared holiday meal with your extended family, how are goods exchanged? What if you treated your next Thanksgiving meal as a market? You would be handing over cash or clicking Venmo before passing your mashed potatoes or your kimchi to your grandmothers. You'd be haggling over whether or not the cranberries are really worth paying for. And in this setting, if you turn to a market can fix anything logic, you would definitely hurt some feelings. And that's because exchanges, whether through markets or shared meals together or giving gifts, exist in the context of relationships. And the kinds of exchanges we choose to use communicate status and power, whether you really care about other people, and whose priorities are valued. There's something safe and comforting for a lot of people in believing that an invisible hand will just distribute goods well enough if we just stop fussing about everything. But market systems alone will not solve all of our problems. Persistent inequalities, moral failures, or to be very stark about it, they will not comfort you on your deathbed. Vocational paths that creatively and doggedly pursue the common good will require exploring beyond the comfortable market narrative. Now, the market can fix anything narrative is closely tied to our second one, which is merit makes me deserve it. If the market narrative teaches us to treat labor as just another commodity, it's only a small leap to start believing that people who get paid the highest price for their labor, the highest income, are those whose labor, and maybe even their personhood, is more valuable. But value is slippery in a market. Value and price doesn't necessarily correlate with value in skill or moral good or benefit to society. One might just as likely receive a high salary for work that benefits the common good as for work that does harm. One might work very hard, contribute to the common good, and not feel they're receiving what they deserve. The narrative makes personal attainment into the main purpose of life. To delve into this narrative with students, I sometimes ask this question: who worked harder? A kindergartner who grew up to become a lawyer, earning a six-figure salary, or a kindergartner who grew up to pack items in an Amazon warehouse for $27,000 a year? In classes of predominantly white and high-achieving students, often the majority will quickly answer the lawyer. But then what often happens is someone will raise their hand and they'll say, sometimes timidly or with like a spurt of frustration, couldn't it be the Amazon worker? What if their home didn't have enough food? What if their parents weren't able to help with their homework? What if they had dyslexia? What if English wasn't their second language? And sometimes these conversations kind of end with like a mic drop finality where someone's like, how dare you ignore how hard that struggling kindergartner worked? So hard work simply does not correlate with earnings or moral goodness. But the merit makes me deserve it narrative assumes that there's no real boundaries to getting what you want if you have enough perseverance, which means it makes poverty of all sorts out to be a natural comeuppance of people who presumably have the morally reprehensible quality of laziness. Rather than pursuing the common good by changing discriminatory or exclusionary social structures, this narrative merely prescribes moral redirection for the poor. So, exposing the harms done by the market can solve anything and merit makes me deserve it narratives is a starting point, but we also need new narratives. So here are two alternative narratives I've seen through the lives of people who do prioritize the common good. First, new narrative: I belong to memberships. Think back to that opening story I told, the overturning of that student who is learning that they already belong to social structures, that those social structures do affect their life too. They were learning that they're already a part of memberships. Before we can form intentional vocational steps towards seeking the common good, we have to recognize that we are already part of a commons, for better or worse. We're already part of one big social body. As the theologian Paul Waddell, who we keep quoting, and he's actually, the book is dedicated to him, so it's not accidental. He writes, justice does not create a bond between us and others. It recognizes and honors a bond that is already there. Or in the famous words of Martin Luther King Jr., injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Students often assume that if they want to make a positive change in the world, they need to add some task to their life. Go protest or purchase an ethically branded product or pursue a service-type profession like healthcare, which is fine. But that mindset ignores the reality that our life is already shaping and being shaped by our memberships in society. There's no neutral option. Pursuing the common good is not just something we tack on, it's already happening or not happening in our everyday choices. Smiling at your classmate, choosing to call your parents, biking to work, liking or not liking a social media post. All these little things add up to bigger changes, like reducing depression rates or preventing human-induced climate change on the other side of the globe. Vocation is happening through all the stuff that is not on your to-do list. So, we need to overturn our imagined disconnection from society and recognize we have memberships. But merely having memberships is not enough. We also need to consider what to do with those memberships. What sort of membership is good? Often answering this question seems to force us to choose between two opposing options. Either a good membership is one where I receive well, or it's where I give well. We debate this through our sort of plans in life. Will I be happiest as a consumer or a philanthropist? And at first glance, we Christians might assume that philanthropy is the better option. It is more blessed to give than to receive. So we assume that good vocations are for people who give and give. They're social workers, teachers, nurses, or parents. But not coincidentally, those careers are high burnout, underpaid, often gendered as feminine. Because we also assume that people who give abundant generosity don't really require much in return. Now, meanwhile, we are surrounded by messages that it is shameful to receive too much. So, while good and kindly people give, strong and successful people earn. The former get stars in heaven, the latter get whatever money can buy, and each supposedly gets some kind of contentment. But we're left with this high-achieving, wealthy philanthropist as the pinnacle of greatness. But instead, I propose that memberships are good when we have a place for both giving and receiving. In other words, mutuality makes life good. The good life happens with an ongoing giving and receiving relationships with others. Life is good when we mutually depend on humans and the natural world and the spiritual realm. My favorite story of this is I recently came to be the caretaker for 2 sheep, and these folks have heard about my sheep, Frodo and Bilbo. They have been teaching me how mutuality can overturn our culture's dominant understandings of vocation. People often ask me, what do you plan to do with your sheep? What do you do with your sheep? It's a seemingly logical question from a market-based view of life. In the past, our family has raised chickens and pigs, and people generally assume that those are utilitarian. They produce eggs and pork. But the sheep draw out a deeper reason that I raise animals. They're too old for tasty meat. Their wool is hardly worth the cost of shearing in today's market. And as castrated males, they can't even father a next generation. When people ask why I have sheep, I usually answer ecology. Ecology is a word to describe the mutual relationships between creatures. More than anything else I can figure out for our particular plot of land, sheep work. They nourish their bodies by eating invasive seeds and preventing them from spreading. They transform weeds into manure for deep, rich soil. And as I care for them, I've realized that they offer more than just a lawn mowing and soil amendment service to me. They offer an opportunity to care. Moving their fences to welcome them into new lush pastures, filling their water pails, scratching their woolly necks. It's not just a duty that I complete for some productive value. It's what gives me the joy of being tied up in a right relationship to place and self and others and soul. So seeing vocation as a meshwork of mutuality offers a cure for some of the most prevalent pathologies we see in attempts at vocation. Mutuality rules out ableism because we recognize that able-bodiedness is only temporary and partial. Having limited abilities is central to being what it is to be a living creature. Mutuality likewise blocks the workaholic burnout tendencies of those who define their success according to a never-ending quest for efficiency and accomplishment. In mutuality, rest also becomes as much a part of vocation as work. Mutuality finds a place for unemployment within vocation. Mutuality prevents the white savior models of service in which one who gives is morally superior to the seemingly helpless one who receives. Mutuality points us toward models of service as accompaniment. So to choose a vocation, knowing that I belong in a membership and mutuality makes life good, does not preclude participating in markets or developing the necessary skills for a career, but it does require overturning much of what we assume to be true. We need to redirect our aims by defining success not by merit in markets, but according to the rightness of mutual relationships, finding our place in ecologies of dependency. I hope you'll embark on your own journey of overturning. And if you want to talk to me further, you can find me there.
Thank you, Christine. And yes, this has been a really wonderful process to be able to work together over the course of a year in conversation on the book. So as we sort of expanded the language and frameworks of vocation, the part 2 of the book is an inquiry into the transformations of the common good. And in this section, the authors take up the language of the uncommon and marginal as fundamental to our common well-being. There is an emphasis throughout the section on advocacy, social action, and community engagement. There is a focus on talking with students and are really challenging ourselves to care about causes that are not ours, but rather to sort of cultivate empathy and compassion for causes that are not our own. And one of the animating questions here in this section is, how do prevailing notions of the common good need to be transformed? And how can that shape your understanding of calling? So there are 3 essays in this section. Again, they're on that handout. A chapter on the vocation of advocacy, and the concluding chapter on expanding the borders of a common good through transformational encounters. And today we're joined by Geoffrey Bateman, whose chapter is on queer vocation and the uncommon good.
Thank you. I'm just going to set my timer here so I don't go over.
I'll set mine.
Okay, great. That's good.
Good job, Matt. Thanks.
What I'm just going to do is really, this is my own disciplinary training, just read the opening section of the introduction to my essay, because I think it lays out the big argument. It doesn't have as many of the illustrative details or maybe pedagogical approaches, but I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. So to get started, so a few years ago, in a course I teach on queer theory and social justice, a queer-identified student in the class met with one of our counselors in our career center to review their resume and prepare to apply for jobs after graduation. The counselor pretty strongly advised and recommended that the student not include their internship at an LGBTQIA+ advocacy organization for fear it might limit their opportunities in their future. This was well-intentioned advice. However, it served to confuse and frustrate the student, for they were out to their family, their faculty, and their peers, and they assumed and wanted to, and that they could and should be so professionally. It represented to them a very important accomplishment. The internship had powerfully shaped their vocational discernment and represented an experience that they thought potential employers would and should value. Unfortunately, the counselor's advice reinforced homophobic notions about the inappropriateness of being out in the workplace, signaling that the student should remain discreet, if not closeted, about their queerness. In the end, it also served the exchange to thwart and impede the student's desire to live authentically. And it, in a way, undermined their calling into a particular kind of professional community. How should they respond, and what should they do? The student asked me and the rest of the class that day. The answers we explored, illustrated, and sought to dismantle the many barriers that LGBTQIA+ students face in their vocational exploration as they attempt to live their lives in what, again, we'll have another Paul Waddell gesture, magnanimous fashion. As they attempt to pursue meaningful work and engage in the common good, especially in relation to and integrating of how sexuality and gender structures our civic and professional worlds. In many of our communities, we have made great strides against the harassment, the discrimination, and violence that LGBTQI+ people face. At the same time, we still struggle to affirm the inherent goodness of queer lives and view them not just as something to tolerate, but to celebrate, and I would even add, to value as exemplary. Further, we do not yet view queerness itself as a common good, or consider it integral and a constitutive element of our common flourishing. Despite the collective intent and actions of many of us in higher education, we also don't fully embrace queerness in our sector, especially at faith-based colleges and universities, even as many have in recent years also made important strides in transforming our campuses into being far more inclusive of queer forms of difference. And I would include my own university, Regis University, a Jesuit Catholic institution where I teach. As I've argued elsewhere, vocation as a field in its deep-rootedness in Christianity and Christian traditions continues to need ongoing transformation and make available its deep tradition and deep resources to all LGBTQI+ students. And even as queer people in the US have made gained increasing political legitimacy and secured important rights that make certain vocational choices available to us, thinking about love and work, so marriage equality and non-discrimination in employment, these gains remain unevenly secured across the country depending on the state someone lives in and the intersectional nature of their identities. In certain contexts, LGBTQI+ people remain subject to legal hostility and political eradication. To complete matters further, many of these strides, which from a more mainstream political perspective seem worthy goals, reinforce what some queer scholars would call a neoliberal homonormative agenda that many queer theorists and other folks would continue to critique. They would do so because they see such gains as also threatening to occlude and marginalize other forms of queerness, especially those forms of difference that intersect with other categories of identity and oppression. Forms of difference that are far less palatable to our larger political and social imaginations. Instead, these critics anchor their vision of sociality, collectivity, and a sense of the future in more radical transformations of what we can describe as our white supremacist, heteronormative, settler colonialist social order, in which they would then anchor various forms and continue to explore forms of queer negativity, resistance, and utopian desires. Thus, queerness as a common good, or perhaps more challenging, a queer transformation of the common good, remains fiercely contested. Recent legal hostility to supporting our transgender youth show how the particularities of certain forms of queer difference still interfere with the shaping of our shared sense of the common good, such that the common good can and still does function to exclude or diminish certain forms of queerness. In response, I would say we need to reorient our understanding of the value itself of commonality and transform the common good in order to preserve more fully space for difference and particularity. This is not necessarily a new argument. Many feminist and queer scholars of color have historically engaged in difference in this very way, attempting to recast our dominant social imaginary so that it sees difference not as a threat or something to neutralize or assimilate, but more as a common resource that might be valuable and good in its irreducible particularity. To better serve and support our vocational work then with our queer students, but I would also say for all of our students, we might instead embrace a notion of the uncommon good. So in the midst of either common goods, and this might go back to what Dr. VanLaningham was sharing with us, the facilities are the resources that we share in common that promote our flourishing as humans, or the common good as a feature or space of collectivity for our deliberation and discernment about the good life. In those areas, we must be better attuned to the differences and particularities that in fact we might not share and might not even really understand, but that we could learn to potentially value. So these uncommon goods represent that which we might not be able to absorb or integrate into our common understanding or our common endeavors, and yet ought to be considered necessary and essential for the pursuit of the good life for all. Queerness in all of its many forms can and should play an important role in our collective imaginations, our cultures, our social, political, and economic worlds. This includes the visibility and circulation of uncommon forms of desire, sexual and gender identities that defy binary norms, bodies in all the various ways that queer people inhabit them, stylize them, and present them, and even sex in its unusual forms. Ultimately, the circulation and accessibility of queerness are essential for our common flourishing, for they help deconstruct stultifying and lethal forms of homogeneity that commonness, in maybe its less than generous forms, can promote. Even as such queerness might be particular to minoritized identities in some communities, or only partially shared across our population, and thus might be uncommon, such uncommonness seems worth holding out for as an important good and as an important facet of our collective well-being, so that all might live lives of dignity. As Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick observes in the first axiom of epistemology of the closet, quote, "People are different from each other." I find this still, about 30 years later, a simple and yet profound observation that our collective, that we still have yet to grapple with fully. Our collective work in seeking to embed our students' vocational journeys within a vibrant and flourishing common good must affirm this fundamental fact and preserve our ability to be different in community. We must hold space for the tension between particularity and commonality so that those whose differences cannot be assimilated can live out their lives with meaning and purpose within the context of a more just and humane world. The rest of my chapter, just to give a little bit of, no spoilers, but a preview, takes up this tension and explores in vocational terms the relationship between the inner call of identity and the outer call of the common good, doing so with a deep skepticism and appreciation for both. It interrogates vocational models and their theological underpinnings, trying to find a way to account for the importance of LGBTQI+ identities and their lived experiences, and integrating some queer theologians who call for quote-unquote erotic justice within our work, and also queer theorists' resistance to neoliberal paradigms. Queering vocation at the individual level, though, in terms of maybe how we work with our individual queer students, is not sufficient, though, because it depends on a transformation of the common good and the context and the structures that make the flourishing of any given life and community possible. I also, in the second half of the chapter, I look at queer vocational discernment within a much larger concern for our collective well-being. This requires also an engagement with some of queer theories, what we might call their queer descent from normative sociality and the common good, even as and we can seek to recuperate it through desires for a utopian future, in which LGBTQI+ people might actively participate in creating a world in which all can flourish by transforming our relationship to particular forms of difference. To go back to the opening anecdote, I would say, and these are some of the kind of more pedagogical or concrete approaches that I talk about, we might think about, rather than if a student comes to us asking for direct advice on what they might do because of how they want to live out their identity, rather than prescribing any given approach, to kind of go back to the notion of where the deep gladness and the world hunger meet, that the place of meeting. I can suggest different kind of advising tools that ask students more about the meaning and the purpose that they attach to their own identities. There's been some work I've done on our blog I can share later too on Vocation Matters around scanning and knowing the context into which that they are going to find themselves, given the variety of situations across our country, just on a concrete level to help with that queer vocation. The more that we know about those contexts and the more we know about our individual students, we can facilitate deeper conversations around what it is that they are wanting and needing and doing in connection with what is out there, expected constraints or opportunities. And again, the vocational work then is helping connect those two things together. So I'm happy to share some helpful questions and frameworks for that later too, if that's interesting, and other kinds of both pedagogical and advising approaches to truly help our students find that place where then the contextual issues and the structural parts of our world are shaping their developing vocational discernment. So thank you.
Thank you, Drs. Bateman and Jeske, so far. So then the third part of the volume is focusing on pedagogies and practices for the common good. And here we're asking questions: how do educators across the university invite changes in perspective about serving others beyond self? And how do we teach toward difficulty and toward courageous conversation that helps us reframe, overturn, expand these frameworks of both vocation and the common good? So in this section, we really unpack some pedagogies of discussion and dialogue around difference and compassion, and also address burnout in creating sustainable vocations in caring for self and others. There are 3 chapters in this section. I have a chapter on reading with strangers and how reading helps build a collective vocation. And Megan Slining takes a public health model and draws on compassionate pedagogy in her chapter on cultivating sustainable vocations. We're joined today by David Timmerman, whose chapter, A Too Uncommon Common Good, the Role of Discussion and Deliberation in Vocational Discernment, leads this section off. David.
Great to be here. Thank you, Erin, and good colleagues. I'm really excited about this conference because I love the title right from the start. So, Called Together in an Age of Discord. And when I think about how I came to write the chapter that I did, I'm reminded that actually when Erin was speaking to me about it, I guess recruiting me might be the term, and I was happy to be recruited, by the way, because I think the world of NetVUE. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But it was the summer of 2020, maybe the fall of 2020, and for I'm sure everybody in this room, that whole year was quite a year. I know it was for me. I was a provost at Carthage College. We had a difficult recruiting year the prior year, so we were down about 100 students in the class that entered in the fall of 2019. I was well over $1 million in revenue. I was sweating that whole year, and we were making plans to have a much better year that coming fall, in the fall of 2020. We'd done a number of things, some of them hard, some of them just getting things in order. And then March of 2020. And I remember when we sent our students home for spring break, and I knew the odds were pretty high. We weren't going to be asking them to come back, or we were going to have to give them an option. I remember feeling sick in my stomach for like 2 weeks straight, because I knew what the impact would be on over 400 full-time employees, 200 part-time employees. And then we went through that summer, and like I'm sure everybody in this room, we made all kinds of plans for how we were going to be able to welcome students back that fall of 2020. Distancing, masks, changing all the classrooms, adding sections, you know the drill. On and on it went. And then a terrible thing happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which was that a black man, Jacob Blake, while resisting police officers' entreaties, got into his car, and they worried that he had a weapon. They shot him 7 times in the back. He was paralyzed from the waist down, and things got really difficult in Kenosha, Wisconsin. There were protests. There was violence. The National Guard was called in, and then I'll tell you that was the week before freshmen were to arrive on campus, and so families who were sending their sons and daughters to Carthage were seeing that on the news. Very difficult time. I'm thankful for everyone I work with, because we got ourselves through that. We did welcome those students to campus. We made some exceptions. We did what we needed to do. But then it was time to start thinking about writing a chapter for the next NetVUE book. and I just want to tell you, that was an age of discord at my school, and even in the things that I did. There's been a beautiful fruit from all of that, though, because I can tell you proudly today that a number of things that are going on our campus started in that fall semester. We now are in our 4th year of a program that every freshman goes through called the Intercultural Development Inventory, and then they get connected with a coach who helps them move along the continuum from a monocultural perspective to an intercultural perspective. If you've never heard of that, I highly recommend it. That's going strong. We started a course within our general education curriculum called Legacies of Race and Racism. We've been training faculty in that over the last 3 summers due to a generous gift, and I think we now have about 15 faculty members who are teaching sections in that every year. So a lot of good came from it, but it was difficult. When I was thinking about how to contribute to this book on the common good, of course I did what my good colleagues did, which is I went back to my own field, my own roots, the things that I knew, and I tried to ask myself, how can I contribute? And so my field is rhetoric. I was trained at a PhD in communication studies. I taught public speaking for 20 years straight, from 1990 to 2010, either 1 or 2 sections every semester, other than being on sabbatical. And then I taught debate, and I coached the debate team and drove students around in a van all through the Midwest on too many icy roads to debate tournaments. So I went back to that, and to me, when I think about being called in an age of discord, the way I would frame it is we're struggling as human beings, we're struggling as Americans, sadly, we're struggling all over the world to have respectful, productive deliberation and discussion leading to understanding and cooperative action. That's, to me, the fundamental thing that's going on, and that's just my perspective. So we're struggling to have respectful and productive deliberation, to understand each other better, and then to work together toward common shared goods. a scholar who's been connected with NetVUE, other than Paul Waddell. By the way, Paul Waddell is in the room, and we're so glad you are, Paul. Yeah, it turns out that, like, this is the 4th volume. There's 3 volumes. There's a number of other books connected to this. This is a whole scholarly enterprise. And Paul Waddell is a leader in that, but he's among many wonderful people. And Darby Ray is another one of those individuals. I went to a NetVUE conference, I don't even remember, years ago now. I've been connected with NetVUE since, for the last 2 decades at least. And I highly recommend it for you and your institution. If you're not familiar with it, get familiar with it. It's a fantastic organization that does great good. And it's, to me, as having been a dean of a faculty and now a provost, it's been the single most productive thing that's connected faculty and staff on the campuses where I've served in a common shared mission, because, you know, I like to say we're all educators, every faculty member, every staff person, and the vocation work, no matter where someone's coming from. You know, we have Muslim faculty at both of my institutions who've been connected with this, Jewish faculty, non-theistic faculty, and staff, all those categories and other categories. This is like that common place that I think gets to the heart of why we all love doing what we do, working with students. So I highly recommend it. Please look into it. But Darby Ray said this: how do we, as individuals and as institutions, meet students where they are in this time of global pandemic, entrenched inequity, climate emergency, and imperiled democracy, with the anxiety, despair, denial, disconnection, and other signs of existential threat that these realities produce for so many of them? How do we do this? One way that I've approached this, again, I would say through my discipline, and the way that I described in this chapter, is going back to some fundamental practices of deliberation and discussion, and then fitting them for the current time. So most of my research is actually on ancient Greece and the foundings of democracy and rhetoric, actually all at the same time, and the way that education began through the sophists with the purpose of training citizens for democracy. So all of a sudden, you have this burgeoning democracy. Admittedly, it was limited. It was limited to just certain classes of society. It was limited to males. It was limited to Athenians. Incredibly limited. But within that context, there are still lessons to be learned. And one of them is that you need an educated citizenry to have a functioning democracy, because you have to have individuals who can listen to the arguments of others, respond to them, learn from them, maybe be persuaded by them, or make different arguments and persuade others, and then be able to vote intelligently. At some basic level, you need individuals who are able to do that. And in our own country, there have been various movements along the way, going back to the town hall movements in the early days, the Chautauqua movement, the Lyceum movement. More recently, we have, I don't know if others are familiar with this organization, we have a very active Braver Angels chapter on our campus, and we will actually be hosting the national meeting of the Braver Angels next summer. Very excited about that. National Issues Forums, there are so many of them that continue to this day. And what I describe in my chapter and what I did in certainly in the last part of the time I was teaching is take a lot of that and try to infuse it into the classroom. My colleagues and I did that in the public speaking classroom so that deliberation became a skill that we taught students in those sections, but also in other general education courses I taught, such as a course called Citizenship, which at the college where I was prior to Carthage was a course that all seniors were required to take as part of their general education. And so what did we do? Well, first step was, well, let me just say this takes, I'm going to stop for a slight tangent. This takes courage, okay? It takes courage to have students in whatever form, whether it's deliberation or some other form, talk about and address real issues where there's actual disagreement among reasonable people, to bring those up in the classroom. It's easier, I suppose, to just say, well, we don't treat that because, you know, I don't know, I'm teaching this subject or that subject and it doesn't come into it. It's easier to just not bring it up, right? I mean, way easier in some ways, right? Oh, okay, or to do it in some kind of confined, sanitized way. But what I'm talking about is actually bringing it up in the real, in reality, and I would suggest not in the most explosive topics to begin with, okay? Actually, easier topics. And so I'll suggest a few here when I get to the practical example. But then a first step layering in some form or another is actually to help students understand that there is a difference between productive discussion, productive deliberation, and unproductive discussion and unproductive deliberation, right? And a term that has been used that I've found less helpful over the years is civil discourse. That term, I think, probably was rightly critiqued in different ways. So I, years ago, moved to just productive and unproductive, and that can just lead to a discussion. It's kind of an easier discussion. Well, what are the characteristics of productive deliberation and discussion? And what are the characteristics of unproductive? And how might we understand those? So I'll just suggest a few, and then talk about how I know a lot of faculty use this in their classrooms a bit. So on the unproductive side, none of these are going to be surprising. Lack of listening, division, focus on winning, combativeness, dichotomous thinking, dogmatism. On the productive side, listening, provisionality, inclusiveness, imagination, intellectual humility. That sense that I can be in a conversation with you and it's a live possibility that you're going to change the way I think about something. A live possibility. I'm ready to have that happen. And hopefully you're entering in that conversation ready to have that happen too. That's when I think it gets real and it gets genuine. So how can this happen in a classroom? Well, again, I wouldn't take on the biggest issues right from the start. Here's a couple of examples that I used. So, and this goes back to a small college in a small town in rural Illinois, Monmouth College, West Central Illinois, farm fields all around, very small town. And a shrinking population because large agriculture, big ag, was buying up all the family farms. So just this is happening, lots of places. And so some things that they were dealing with there at that time in the town were things like how close can a windmill be to the town property or not close. Another one was incentivizing, what is it called, TIF districts downtown for new businesses to start that might actually benefit both the college and the city to bring and get students coming down to downtown more instead of just staying on campus. They're teaching bilingual education in the schools. And I would just say each of these are examples of things that aren't quite all the way up to the most difficult things to have conversations about, right? So, and that'd be another suggestion is you need to walk before you can run, and to go to an issue like what's occurring in the Middle East right now, or other topics. That's probably not the first place to go, but there are plenty of other topics that you can give students skills and abilities that they can build toward these things. Okay, and by the way, the common thing is to have classroom boundaries, right? Classroom rules. You can type in such a thing into Google. You'll come up with 100 examples of it. A technique I've found helpful, and I know a lot of other faculty have, is to suggest a few things, but then give students the ability to also be a part of constructing the boundaries for discussion in the classroom. And the least they'll do is say some of the things you would probably have wanted to be in place anyway, but they'll put them in their own words. And then sometimes they'll surprisingly come up with some additional things based on like local things that have been happening on campus or that they've experienced. Great, all of that's good. And then you can enter into conversation and discussion and deliberation with a little more confidence that at least if things get out of hand, now we go back to, well, what were the, something happened here. I'm kind of like a referee at this point, and I want to think about it myself, and I want you to help me think about it. Like we crossed some kind of line there. What was that line? How would we describe it? What can we do? And just having named that we're entering into a space and a conversation that does have some boundaries actually is helpful. An example that I like to tell because it's top 5 moments in whatever 25 years of teaching was working with 2 seniors, two young men, and we came up with different things that were happening in the city of Monmouth at the time, and they picked this tax district topic. And they did research on it, and then I talked to, right? Of course, you have to do all the setup, right? So I talked to the local Kiwanis Club, and I said, look, we've got this citizenship course, we've got these students, I'm teaching them how to lead a deliberation. I know you meet the first Thursday of every month for lunch at the whatever place, and could we come and lead a discussion, maybe have that go an hour and a half instead of an hour that day. You have lunch for the first half hour. We have this conversation. Yes, they're just thrilled. They were thrilled to do this. So I remember we're driving down. These students are really nervous. They have their hand out. They've learned some things. 1 minute, okay, but they're scared. So we get in there. And it's a sort of a setup that I give them. They make a presentation of a couple minutes. They let the people know what's on the handout related to these tax districts. Then we get into the conversation. There's a very aggressive person there, an individual, like his family's been in that town for 100 years, and he's anti-college. They keep buying houses, taking them off the tax rolls. Our fire trucks need to keep going over there because somebody pulls a fire alarm, on and on, right? He's got a perspective, and they're trying to manage this individual, and I'm getting more and more nervous as the instructor, and I'm telling you, I was 3 seconds from interrupting and politely shutting this individual down, and then the students did it themselves. They just did it, and they did it well, and then they got the conversation going. They got other people involved. That individual did sit down, and we got back in the car, and you would have thought that they just won the Super Bowl. We shut the doors on the car. It was winter, right? And we shut the doors on the car and start to drive, and they just couldn't stop talking. I mean, they just were so thrilled, and I was so thrilled for them, and it was so empowering for them. So anyway, I think I should probably pull it together there, but just to say, this has been incredibly rewarding for me, my connections with NetVUE, this project, and I'm sure we're headed toward questions, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna close up.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think you've gotten a sense of the variety and breadth and depth of the project. We have a 4th section of the volume, Callings of Campus, Community, and Beyond, which really addresses the university as the commons to reflect on personal and communal formation. In this section, the authors take up all sorts of topics from public monuments and spaces and history, disciplinary learning, the role of the liberal arts, the exploration of freedom and obligation in our vocational discernment. And a couple of the questions from this section that we ask, what is your campus ecology? The connections between environment and participants of your institution. How does it form students and educators for a commitment to others' flourishing? We would encourage, the conversations around all of that at the institutional level. And there are 3 sections here, 3 chapters. One is the university is the common good place, and yes, that there is a reference to The Good Place, the network TV series in that chapter. A chapter on memory and history and vocation, and then the concluding chapter on reforming the vocation of higher education for formation throughout our lives. I just wanted to conclude by talking about the epilogue to the volume, and which brought the 4 of us, along with many of the writers, to this project. We gathered a final time in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and visited George Floyd Square, which is on the corner of East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was murdered on May 25th, 2020. It was an August afternoon, and we were met upon our approach by Jay Webb, who is a community leader whose unofficial role as caretaker of the intersection was apparent when he welcomed us and thanked us for coming to stand in the gap. The title of the epilogue is The Ecology of the Common Good, Vocation, and the Gaps. He's invited all of us to plant rescued plants in the garden at the center of the square, encircling a sculpture of Black Power Fist, and that is a picture I took there, and that is the garden of the square that we were planting in. After learning that we were educators, he invited us to repeat iterations of this phrase. It doesn't matter who you are, what kind of professor you want to be. It matters what you want the world to be. He then gifted us with packages of seeds, pictured there, wildflowers, herbs, sunflowers, to take with us to plant when we return to our home communities. This communal experience of encountering a place of injustice, violence, loss, and grief, and being met with an invitation to stand in that gap and plant with others was transformative on many levels. As we planted, we knew we were standing in the gap of the sacramental, profound, and symbolic. The makeshift roundabout, built of cinder blocks and fading mulch, necessitated that every approaching car had to pause and consider the square, another invitation to stand in the gap. We saw visitor after visitor welcomed by Jay as they carried plants to that intersection. We hoped for growth not just for that place, but for the wider web of relationships and communities that brought us there, and we felt the urgency and necessity of reaching toward a collective purpose. And in the interest of time, I will not talk about the epilogue specifically, but I did want to just close with the opening quote from the volume, which is from Marilyn Robinson's novel Gilead. There are many ways to live a good life. And then to quote a mural which was at the Memorial Cemetery near George Floyd Square, the eighth wonder of the world is us. And so in this project called Beyond Ourselves, Vocation and the Common Good, this I think is a nice frame and sort of touch points for our presentation and the sort of collective work that's represented in the volume. And now we would love to take questions and responses to all of the panelists' presentations and engage in conversation. So thank you for your attention.
We have about 18 minutes for questions. I just want to remind you, when you have a question, this is Christine, this is Erin, this is Geoffrey, and this is David. So
and that's
you can
Matt.
call them by their name.
Thanks,
So,
Matt.
go right ahead.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what my question for it's for any of you. Thank you for this. This was great. Back to the beginning when you were kind of setting the stage and you started with the Buechner quote and talked in this idea of, well, what happens if we start with the hunger, and then you went on to talk about that approach as social responsibility. And I'm those of us who work in higher education or who've been around NetVUE or who work with Vocation, we have these tools and resources. We spend so much time thinking about discernment. And I'm wondering about if any of the authors and any of the pieces addressed the discernment of who gets to determine what are the worthy social responsibilities. Like if we've got these individual tools of discernment of gladness of self, how are we determining what are the appropriate social responsibilities?
I would say that probably each essay in the collection addresses maybe a different social responsibility in some ways. I mean, as you heard, David's chapter does talk about gun violence or something along those lines. But I think that the chapter by Jonathan Golden, which is about transformational encounters and the value of direct encounter, working with the Emmanuel Levinas work on the transformation of encountering the other, really privileges sort of our local and our direct encounters. So there's not one social responsibility, there are many, and that's where our focus on the local, the commons, your commons, initially is different than my commons, even though we're all part of a common home. That would be probably the argument first, is to start with your backyard as opposed to the world's deep hungers. Go ahead, David. That would be my initial.
What's behind my question?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I've done it too. It's just easier to see in others. I've seen my students misinterpret local needs.
Yeah, look, right, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think we felt that too. So, I mean, another way, I might come at it this way, but to say, I think a number of us have sought to help students parse these things out. Like, so for example, I'm at a Lutheran institution, but we have several Catholic institutions, others are Presbyterian institutions, and so, and then, and students at, say, a Lutheran institution who are practicing Muslims, right? So to me, the discernment conversations that we're seeking to have with students is actually helping them make sense out of their callings, right? And then also their context. And I think you're thinking about context, and we do need to, because it's, you know, we are all situated. Your students are situated, our students are situated. And so, so to me, it's deepening their understanding of how they can figure those things out for themselves and keep an open mind about the future. So, yeah.
Building off that too, I would say, and this isn't a perfect answer, but you know, you think about our institutional callings. I think helping students read context is really important. And if there's ways in your departments, your large institutions, like what are the callings there that are listed out that have some congruence with this idea? Because that gives them models and ways to approach it. And I do a lot of service learning and community-based research too. And so it's also about the existing relationships that we, meaning our institutions, other professors, yourselves, the Service Learning Center, whatever the place would be that already has existing relationships with those contexts. It makes it easier on us as faculty because we're not reinventing the wheel all the time, but we're developing relationships in relationship to other relationships. And I think that is, it's both pragmatically makes it a little easier, and it also helps, it's helping students also, as one who probably wrote one of the more theoretically, like perhaps too dense chapters, like getting anchored in the thing here too, right? Like get away from the theory, like we have this theoretical notion of some need way over there, like let's find the relationships and the webs that we have right here and use as a modeling for folks, given like the collective agreement of whatever the institutional conversation is.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this discussion. My question is about when we talk about vocation on universities, we typically make it for the students that are currently there, 18 to 22. And when we talk about getting vocation off of campus, that spatial, does any of the work in this volume or for the panel, have you had any sort of experience of kind of a longitudinal approach that you bring on alumni to talk about what they've been doing, so it's not just for the here and now, but also when you leave this great and glorious place?
Yeah, the fourth section of the volume. So first of all, the university is a common good place. That chapter, the argument there is about sort of institutional spaces, but also the space, like the town-gown divide and sort of understanding the relationships to community. But then the final chapter talks about sort of vocations across the life course and bringing in, and that's that sort of reframing the purpose of higher education sort of throughout the life course. So to bring alumni in and understand our purpose of educating across generations and between generations. Yeah, so there are, then that middle chapter in that section too is about memory. So how do we use history to teach us for present and future? Yeah, great question, thank you.
Go right ahead.
Yeah.
Ben? Yes, thank you all. I wonder if any of you have anything to elaborate on about the idea that individuals might have to sacrifice, right, for the common good. Not only just think first about what the world needs, but even, and then kind of think about what your own joy is or preferences are. The commons metaphor to me is really rich and exciting, and the tragedy of the commons is that everybody's kind of individually incentivized to overgraze the proverbial pasture, and so but thinking about how to manage the commons is everybody has to kind of be willing to give something up, and so I wonder, I didn't hear that much discussion of that element. I just would be curious if anyone wanted to add anything on that.
Yeah, what you're asking about makes me think about what I was slowly putting into words as I was hearing Ryan's first question too. One of my favorite moments in our seminar the week when we were reading things together and talking about them together, Jonathan Goldman, who is a Jewish scholar, what's his institution?
Drew University.
Drew University. His chapter is about service learning, to a certain extent, transformational encounters. I just remember him standing up, and there was this moment where we were sort of hashing out, do we really expect people to pursue the common good even when it's not relevant to their own lives? And it worked its way into my chapter. I had this little line that's something like, when we're giving to people because we can see our shared fate, or we love only those who seem similar to ourselves, in a sense, it's like an extension of just loving ourselves. Are we really able to love someone who is other at a greater distance, that it's not just, I love you because you remind me of myself? And I think that is profound, and I think that's where like this second level of challenge happens. I was just in Dr. Jerry Park, a Baylor sociologist, his talk yesterday, and he talked about this too, that like people who are interested in Black Lives Matter tend to be the people who answer a survey question saying, I perceive Black Lives Matter to be benefiting to me. Like my fate is shared there, right? Which is great, but even when we don't see the shared fate, I think that's the challenge. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
I would say there's two. The language of like caring for causes that aren't our own is part of what Christine is unpacking, but also the language of the stranger and appreciating not just our conception of the neighbor as someone we know, but neighbor is someone who we don't know and may never meet. I try to address that in the chapter on reading with strangers and sort of how we could become both strange to ourselves, but maybe unstrange to each other as a result of reading. But the sort of value of the stranger. I think the other question here is a question of choice, and about how there's a myth in vocation that we choose vocations, but there's so much about vocation that we don't choose. And that gets a little bit to our understanding about the commons, I think, that we sometimes don't choose to be sort of on the sort of receiving end of disparity and suffering and things like that. And but how does that sort of play into our vocational call?
Can I add a wrinkle?
Yeah,
I added a wrinkle too. I mean, in terms of working, I think across lots of different marginalized student population, to flip it as well too. So it's not just a sacrifice to contribute, or there's a sacrifice that's to even enter into that common space. There are many groups of people who have to make sacrifices that go against them, some essential part of themselves, whether that's, all the different differences, right? And I think too, recognizing that there are already great sacrifices that people make to be able to participate in our kind of normative framework of what that common good space or commons is, can be another way to think about it.
There's a line, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick has a book on the generous university that we also use, and she says this is really about conversations that maybe we have to have, not that we want to have. And so I think that your question is, a good one about sort of asking us to sacrifice, and have conversations about that. I mean, they're difficult, courageous conversations, but necessary conversations we need to have with faculty and with students and with staff. Yeah.
Go ahead.
How do you go about communicating the value of the common good to students in a way that allows them to see it for themselves? Because I think there's so much value in communicating these truths that you guys have seemed to be so deeply true and impactful over time, and that students can see your dedication to it. But how do you talk about them in a way that makes it meaningful to them as well? It's something that they're willing to stand for.
Well, I know you read my session yesterday, and so you heard me unpack my current, more extensive research project is on how white Christians come to care about racial justice, which in a sense is caring about a topic that many of them start off believing is not benefiting them personally, although I would argue that it benefits all. But one thing that's really struck me through that research is that it's just such a long process to unlearn things. I think we often go through life thinking that what we're doing is just tacking on new information. We're just like acquiring new ideas, and we sort of, putty them onto our existing framework of reality. But real learning also has to involve unlearning and sort of like scraping off falsities that we believed. Students and humans, we don't like doing that. It's vulnerable, it's painful, it hurts. So I think as an educator, I've just learned to have a deeper appreciation of how hard it is for us to really care about the common good. Like I said, there's these very strong narratives that teach us not to do that, and they're so subtle that we don't see them. So that's not an answer exactly in how to do it, but I think patience is a part of it. Also learning that different students need different things at different times, and helping them to kind of be in productive conversation even while somebody else in the room needs to learn something that you already learned, and vice versa.
No, I would say all those same things, Christine. Just maybe, and I'm coming at it, it's also not a direct, but it's an indirect answer to your question, which is, so one of the interesting sort of movements within, I would say, NetVUE and vocational conversations about vocational working with undergraduate students, which is what this is all about, and so your question's so important, is that we need to move past what had been fairly common maybe a decade ago, or maybe even more recently, which was we were saying to 18 to 22-year-olds, find your passion. Go in a room, sit down for 3 hours, and just figure out your passion. It was petrifying, and it was disconcerting, and in some cases it was even worse than that, right? And so it actually, once you start these conversations, it can be very freeing for someone. The pain of being 18 and someone, you're going to college. Oh, what are you going to study? Not sure. Well, why are you going? How would you even know where to go? What's your major? What's your major? What's your major? It's just driving these people crazy. And so this is a different way to come at that, to say, listen, this was a big world. There is a lot going on out there. There's a lot of needs. You're needed. You're needed in this way, in this way, in this way, and it's bigger than you. And so I think these conversations that which is really where this all leads to, is discernment conversations with students. It's inspiring. It's in some cases freeing. It's just a better perspective than what had been the dominant sort of way that 18-year-olds were spoken to instead of asked questions for too long.
I would say, it goes back to your example, I think helping students directly engage in it in a concrete way. So, not just talk about the common good, but let's have you lead a dialogue in the community, actually actively creating some facet of the common good, which would be at this deliberative space where people can come together and wrestle with their ideas and their disagreements and actually make something productive out of it. In my class on homelessness, the students do usually community-based research projects in consultation with local organizations to engage with actual people experiencing these issues in consultation with them to help answer some questions that would be useful. And the students, by doing that, they see, we see how encountering women experiencing homelessness in relationship to these larger things that we've studied, not just doing that, but their ability then to actually craft something that could make even a partial small difference in understanding other people. So modeling those experiences of dialogue and true listening and getting outside yourself, right? There's nothing like having to write the narrative of another human being where suddenly it's not about you, it's about them, and how do you ethically capture their experience, their life story, their vocation perhaps, right? And for me, those are the things that help students see those connections with this abstract notion of the common good, which can actually, it can be quite concrete, right? We're talking air, water, playgrounds, or but finding those concrete things that'll speak to students and those to actually help them see this is not just about some individual, market thing, or it's but it's modeling that and really getting students to experience them directly. I think is what helps when it works well in my classrooms and my students. They've there's some kind of connection relationship there that it becomes meaningful for their own sense of who they are.
Got time for one more question. Yes.
Christine, you talked about how the narrative of mutuality makes life good sometimes. And you said mutualism places value on rest. So how can students and people in the workplace, as they're setting goals and looking at their future, incorporate that into the discussion, other than just avoiding the extreme of total burnout?
Feel our welcome agenda. It's like 2 sentences probably in my chapter, but such an important aspect of vocation.
I think the one thing that students at my institution are starting to know about vocation from a first year seminar that they all take is that vocation is not the same as career, which is a great starting point, right? Like if anybody in this room hasn't stressed that for people, it's really important to know. Because when we make a career, then we feel like our only purpose in life is what we do on the work days that we're paid for. So I think that's part of it. Let me pause for you all and maybe I'll think of a better answer to your question too.
So I'm going to do my could you repeat your question? Because I totally heard it and then I sort of forget what you said when you were answering. But I felt like it,
Yes, so I was asking, so if mutualism places value on rest, then how do you bring that value into the discussion when you're looking at the future and what your goals are and what your vocation is?
And you said rest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would just piggyback on what you said, Christine, like vocation is also about leisure and it's also about joy. I mean, and those aren't always just selfish. Those are also, I think, about where do you experience joy with other people and where are you recharged. It isn't just about some self-serving thing. It could be the community choir you sing in, or where do you make art with friends, or it's, I mean, fill in whatever, but you know, like, and I think that is, I mean, those activities for students sometimes can feel like it's just one more thing to check off. But if you're doing it right, it's actually about rejuvenation and about connecting to your, you know, your spirit and your sense of like things beyond that, I don't know, that materiality sometimes, and then kind of that working world way.
I would close by saying that the chapter on sustainable vocations is kind of getting at your question, because our goal here is to equip everybody with skills for the long haul, to care for self and others along the way. And Megan Sleining's argument is about the pause and about valuing the pause, our collective pause together, understanding how to take personal and individual pause in our lives, and sort of modeling that in our classrooms and modeling that in our own lives, so that we, to resist burnout, so that we can then care for others. So it's about sort of protecting and cultivating a capacity to care for self and others. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay, well, let's thank our panelists.